Homo sapiens civilizations collapsed. What innovations can be found today to avert a similar outcome? There are many, many other problems facing our species, no doubt, some of which one might consider equally urgent. If so, one can appreciate why it's past time for Homo sapiens to take action. But what will it take for our species to wake up and make the U-turn needed to seriously focus on its own survival before it's too late? Most techno-sapiens and moneyed sapiens behave as though fixing the items on the above lists, or any of the other survival-threatening issues, is not their job or responsibility. This, they seem to think, is the province of governments and politicians, and worldwide bodies like the UN COP21, or UN Climate Change Conference, and IMF, or International Monetary Fund. Many seem content to be the engines of innovation and technologically driven change, and to leave the rest up to the international community, governments, courts, cities, states, politicians, religious leaders, and anyone else who can get 1 million Facebook likes to figure out. Many, too, see themselves as private enterprise and seem to think that private enterprise and governing don't mix. Yet they have no trouble lobbying politicians, governments, and world bodies when doing so will advance their business interests. But if one thinks it's okay to own more than half of an entire species' wealth and resources, then it is more than okay to carry more than half of the responsibility to drive change and refocus away from profits to species survival. From wealth accumulation, unending growth, and monopoly of the majority of the planet's resources, to enabling habitat sustainability. From an obsession with self to a passion for Homo sapiens maturity beyond the point of self-extinction. When it comes to helping Homo sapiens avoid going over the self-extinction cliff, most appear to view getting involved as bad for business. A few, however, have chosen to use their wealth and other resources to help save humanity, even if they can't turn things around. Apple's CEO Tim Cook, for instance, is willing to stand up for Homo sapiens' right to privacy, and is willing to take a stand against those who would compel access to or exploit users' social media and internet use for profit. Elon Musk is reported to have said, "I really don't have any other motivation for personally accumulating assets except to be able to make the biggest contribution I can to making life multiplanetary." And, indeed, he appears to be putting his money where his mouth is, as we say. And Musk is not the only one. Billionaire Yuri Milner and collaborators in breakthrough initiatives seek to fund, among other things, solar system alien life research. Similarly, Silicon Valley's tech incubator, Y Combinator, has decided to take on climate change. It is seeking technology proposals that target removing atmospheric CO2 so as to slow or even prevent getting to a 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures. However, approaches that envision adding genetically engineered algae or minerals to the oceans, or turning deserts into oases, are beginning to sound like yet another set of potential solutions that fall outside of Earth's ecosystems, the way Homo sapiens' choice of agriculture did 10,000 years ago. And we know where that technology adaptation led us. Innovations that flow from a desire to preserve life, of Homo sapiens, flora, fauna, and Earth's habitats, are a good thing. They have the potential to become survival-driven. But to be survival-driven, all aspects of an emerging innovation, from intention to outcome, and everything in between, must be survival-driven. Many of the above may be good enough to earn capitalist, scientific, and even humanitarian, altruism-based innovation prizes, Nobel or not, but it remains to be seen whether any of the above can truly attain evolution's survival-driven innovation standard that's designed to preserve life. What we fail to get about innovation is that the reason Homo sapiens evolved with this capability when all other species didn't is that innovation enables our species to survive, not to get rich, build Silicon Valley unicorns or trillion-dollar companies, invent the next WMD, or create a real Frankenstein creature. To ensure survival, innovation must be survival-driven. If one is thinking of becoming an inventor, innovator, or entrepreneur, here are a few survival-driven innovation guidelines to consider. 1. The innovation must emerge from a deep desire and intent to do no harm and to preserve life, of flora, fauna, Homo sapiens life, and the habitats that support them. 2. Innovators must adopt and organize around a business model or structure that enables them to optimize survival versus profits as the outcome of the innovation. 3. Innovators must refuse support and funding from sources that derive their resources from non-survival-driven business models. 4. Innovators must recognize that natural resources belong to all species and exist for their survival, and are not there to be exploited for economic gain by private corporations and their shareholders. 5. Their products and/or services must be conceived not as stand-alone, but must fit into an integral niche in the human ecosystem. And like an Earth ecosystem, they must be capable of the 360-degree cycle of creation, distribution, consumption, recycle, reuse, and repeat. 6. They must generate zero non-reusable outputs and take ownership for products and services that inadvertently cause harm. 7. They must not pollute or create products that are harmful to species, the environment, or Homo sapiens. 8. Like a biological innovation, the survival-driven innovation must emerge only if there is a survival need, and must go away when that need no longer exists. 9. The supply chain, production, and distribution models and processes must be constrained by what's good for the survival of all species, including Homo sapiens, the environment, and natural ecosystem, not by just what's good for business. And 10. Innovations must follow universal patterns like self-similarity and fractal structures and be in harmonious coexistence with the rest of the natural world, the solar system, and the universe. Facilities should not be abandoned and left to cause harm when they are no longer usable, as spent nuclear power plants or nuclear weapons test sites are today, or spent uranium mine sites that are disproportionately, between 70 and 80%, located on Aboriginal lands and reservations. Evolution's survival-driven innovation, as we have seen, is focused on species survival and habitat sustainability. This is the innovation pattern. Intelligent species innovation, then, was apparently also intended to follow this pattern. This appears to be the only way to do innovation that would not end up destroying all Earth life. Would-be Homo sapiens innovators must choose survival-driven outcomes, and that means their innovations, like evolution's, have got to fit within Earth's ecosystems in a live-and-let-live manner that neither exploits nor lives outside of them. But, as we have also seen, Homo sapiens' current way to do innovation is anything but survival-driven. It is instead driven by profits, continuous growth, and the acquisition of dominant market share, even when that entails destroying Earth's habitats, species, itself, and any chances it might yet have of avoiding self-extinction. To survive, then, Homo sapiens must rethink and re-engineer its way of doing innovation and begin to follow evolution's survival-driven innovation pattern. So what happens when a species chooses to innovate and adapt in ways that put its own survival at risk, as Homo sapiens continues to do? How and what can Homo sapiens do now, if it is not already too late, to adopt evolution's way? According to the evolutionary survival patterns we encountered earlier, adapt, innovate, mature, and migrate to survive, or go extinct. When a species' efforts to adapt, innovate, and mature fails, it has but one option left to avoid extinction. It must be free, willing, and able to migrate, a topic we take up in the next chapter. Chapter 11. Migration. A built-in evolutionary survival response. To survive, an intelligent species must be free and able to migrate. We are at a point in history where we are trapped by our own advances, with humanity increasingly at risk from man-made threats, but without technology sophisticated enough to escape from Earth in the event of a cataclysm. Although the chance of a disaster to planet Earth in a given year may be quite low, it adds up over time and becomes a near certainty in the next 1,000 or 10,000 years. We have less than 100 years to save the human race. Stephen Hawking. Professor Hawking may well be correct, but there is a side to intelligent species evolution often overlooked. The reason intelligent species evolved to begin with. Evolution wants us to survive, is very heavily invested in our species' survival, and has gone to a lot of trouble to make it so. We often ask how Homo sapiens managed to survive when all, even those closest to our species, have gone extinct. Is it possible that, like a thoroughbred breeder with an eye on the prize, evolution might have been selecting and shaping what's needed from earlier hominins, so as to fashion a descendant that will have enough of the right stuff? One to whom it would be willing to give the keys to the planet. One that will be capable of shaping its own destiny, and will, despite having free will, ultimately choose correctly. One that will be willing to take on the very, very difficult challenge that evolving to evolutionary maturity will entail. And yes, one that can go on to populate the stars. Is Homo sapiens the one? Can one imagine for a galactic moment evolution, like an ever-vigilant chaperone, prodding our species on to higher and higher levels of maturity? All through hominins' history, climate events appear to have been used to drive our species to A. Adapt, I. Innovate, M. Mature, M. Migrate, S. Survive, or E. Go extinct, AIMMSE. These appear to constitute an unbreakable, sequential, and recurrent set of species survival patterns an emergent intelligent species must successfully execute at each rung of the species' survival maturity model before it can get to the next higher rung, or go extinct. All earlier hominin species, though successful for a while, apparently failed to negotiate some fateful rung and went extinct, leaving Homo sapiens as the last of their kind. By the time Homo sapiens showed up, evolution was well along the route of winnowing an assortment of hominin species down to one. And 70,000 or so years ago, our species, perhaps carrying the essence of many prior hominin species, ensured its survival by migrating out of Africa at a time of habitat loss due to climate change brought on by the last ice age. The urge to flee to safer climes, to migrate from country to country, across oceans, continent to continent across the planet, and eventually even to other habitable planets in the face of existential threats, is an evolutionary survival trait built into our species every bit as much as the evolutionary compulsion to reproduce. The universe's built-in cycle of birth, life, death ensures that all planets, stars, and galaxies come with an expiration date. Hence, if a species is to survive beyond the expiration date of its home world, migration to other planets and to the stars cannot be optional. But interplanetary migration, it would seem, won't be easy. In order to become an interplanetary species capable of survival beyond its home planet's expiration date, evolution appears to require an emerging intelligent species to first attain evolutionary maturity. The clear indication is that if a species fails to reach that level of maturity, it will experience self-extinction and deny itself the opportunity to become an interplanetary or intersolar system species. In addition, while evolution has built in enough time before Earth's warranty expires, as we have seen, it apparently also requires the resident intelligent species to ensure its habitats remain sustainable as well, or at least until evolutionary maturity is attained. Indeed, the inability to survive beyond the point of self-extinction is believed by some scientists to be a reason we may not have heard from ET as yet. The idea is that potential emerging intelligent species, at varying stages of development on different worlds, assuming there are such, fail to survive long enough to enable discovery and communication with one another. The evolutionary pattern here is clear. To survive, an emergent intelligent species must become mature enough to avoid self-extinction and become capable of interplanetary, intersolar, and probably even intergalactic migration. But to survive, an intelligent species must maintain and sustain the habitats and species that keep the Earth itself alive. As noted in Chapter 7, Habitats, species survival ensures habitat survival, and habitat survival ensures species survival. Just as Homo sapiens wasn't the first life form to change the composition of the planet's atmospheric gases, cyanobacteria beat us to that one, you'll recall, we may not be the first life form to engage in interplanetary migration. Another of those small stuff organisms, like the cyanobacteria and phytoplankton encountered earlier, may have already done that. Some scientists are starting to speculate that these aliens might have actually brought life to Earth from Mars. Richard Carlson wrote a series of books around the theme, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. But as we have seen, and will see again, sweating the small stuff seems to be a specialty of evolution. Life would face significant challenges on Mars today, but billions of years ago, conditions might have been more hospitable. NASA's Mars rover Curiosity found oxygen, not breathable atmospheric oxygen, there is none of that on Mars, water, not running surface water, and sulfate and other elements in a Martian rock sample, all potential clues to prior existence of microbial life. NASA noted that life might have existed on Mars billions of years ago, before it existed on Earth. According to Stephen Benner, a biochemist of Westheimer Institute for Science and Technology in Florida, though it is not yet proven, evidence is accumulating that Earth life may have originated on Mars before being brought here on a meteorite. Some microbes, like extremophiles on Earth, are incredibly hardy and might have been able to survive an interplanetary journey after being blasted off their homeworld by an asteroid impact. Orbital dynamics show it's much easier for rocks to travel from Mars to Earth than the other way around. And every so often, a Mars rock is found on Earth. In fact, as of early 2017, of the 61,000 meteorites found on Earth, 150 of them have been identified as hailing from Mars. If life did migrate to Earth on a meteorite from Mars, we are confronted with yet another of those evolutionary patterns we have been noting. Whenever it comes down to a choice between survival versus extinction of a species, evolution appears to be decidedly on the side of survival. If that were the case here, evolution was not unwilling to cross heaven and earth, literally, and even interplanetary space to sustain life, defying the inexorable universal pattern of birth, life, death, even if that meant shipping microbial life like stowaways aboard a meteorite and crash landing it on the surface of the Earth some 4 billion years ago, when it seemed like Mars could no longer be a suitable habitat for continuing the evolution of life. To survive, life must be able to migrate. Migration is an evolutionary survival pattern that appears to be independent of a species' innovative and technological prowess, and we see it repeated by most species across the Earth, and maybe, if Earth life did originate on Mars, across the solar system, and probably across the universe as well. Humans have not even come close to accomplishing any of the exceptional feats performed by the following creatures, none of which would our species think of as intelligent, but none of their feats depended on their brains, innovations, or technologies. The dinosaurs, for example, were perhaps the most successful animal species so far, surviving for about 165 million to 175 million years, give or take a few million, outliving many times over all those emerging intelligent hominins combined. Cyanobacteria jump-started the engineering of a global atmospheric gas changeover from CO2 to O2, with no knowledge of chemistry. And the tiny ocean plant, phytoplankton, quietly supplies 50 to 80% of the Earth's oxygen today. And these, also, neither saw the innards of an MIT nor hung out in a Silicon Valley unicorn, and would no doubt have had little use for an MBA or the machinations of a global multinational corporation. Evolution went to a lot of trouble to get intelligent species this far, and appears to want intelligent species like Homo sapiens to survive. But amazingly, none of the things our species has come to associate with paths to outsized achievements were at work here. This seems to suggest that species hoping to be evolutionarily successful will find that success most likely doesn't depend upon their IQ, excellence, distinctiveness, ingenuity, brains, or innovations and technologies, but more likely upon their willingness and ability to humbly evolve to evolutionary maturity, as these creatures did. Granted, they did not have a choice, but neither were they intelligent, and that's precisely the point, isn't it? Given all the choices Homo sapiens have, hopefully our brilliance won't blind us and keep us from finding the path to maturity. It would seem that evolution isn't looking for rock stars and rocket scientists. Not that they are somehow bad, but just plain, ordinary folk obsessed with doing the right thing, evolutionarily speaking, reaching for maturity so as to survive. Who knew? This too is a repeating, pervasive, and indispensable survival pattern, which a species can ignore only at its own peril. It brings to mind some of the words found in the Bible at 1 Corinthians 1:26 through 29 of the King James Version. One need not be a believer in God to appreciate the underlying message here. For ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble, are called. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world, and things which are despised, hath God chosen. Yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are. Sentiments those regarded as divergent in the movie Divergent would no doubt share. Like evolutionary sustainability, migration, evolution style, also has a somewhat different take than one might expect. As movement characterizes the rhythm of the universe, so migration choreographs the survival of life. One can't help but notice, as one looks up, how everything in the universe appears to be in a perpetual state of motion. Galaxies are believed to be accelerating away when seen from Earth. The Milky Way galaxy and the Andromeda galaxy are said to be on a collision course. The Sun and the billions of other stars populating the Milky Way galaxy are in perpetual motion as they too travel through the galaxy with their retinues of planets in tow. The planets, like Earth, are perennially orbiting their stars, and the moons are also orbiting their planets. In Earth's past, the continents once merged into supercontinents, Pangaea being the last of at least 3, which then drifted apart again on their tectonic plates, forming the familiar configuration we see today. And given a few more million years, the continents will merge again to form yet another supercontinent. What movement is to the universe, migration is to survival and life. If there is no movement, there is no migration. And if there is no migration, there can be no survival. And if there is no survival, there can be no life. And if there is no life, there can only be extinction. Movement and migration appear to be a fundamental law of the universe. To survive, a species must be free and able to migrate. Yet species do not seem to choose to migrate spontaneously. They are often driven by necessity and often by events that result in habitat impairment, unsustainability, or outright loss. And this appears to be so even for those species that migrate on a cyclical basis. The outcome appears to be heavily influenced by the freedom to migrate, preparation or an a priori state of readiness, triggers or timing, simultaneously occurring events, available means, and the reception, hospitability, or lack thereof at the destination. Monarch butterflies, certain species of birds, wildebeests, and salmon might come to mind when one thinks of cyclic migrations, prompted by the biological urge to reproduce in an ancestral or otherwise suitable habitat setting, or just to move on to the next known place to find food and water. These species are certainly free to migrate, are in a state of a priori readiness, have the means, and are mostly not constrained by circumstances. In the case of salmon, though, there is usually a hungry reception party, including polar bears and humans with large dollar signs in their eyes and nets upstream. Wildebeests face an even more treacherous journey across the predator-filled savannas of Africa, and hungry crocodiles lurk along the riverbanks that come between them and their destination. These horrific experiences notwithstanding, while many individuals die, species manage to survive to live another day, and life continues. Human migration, on the other hand, turns out to be significantly more challenging, if only because we learned how to farm and raise domesticated animals. Except for the few remaining hunter-gatherer tribes, we no longer maintain the skills, preparedness, or, more important, the desire to re-embrace that pack-up-and-go, mobile lifestyle that characterized most of our early ancestors. While we are still mostly able to flee, despite gridlock, border guards, and walls, in the face of danger, modern Homo sapiens are not naturally migratory, but tend to want to settle down in suitable communal locations, usually near rivers and along streams, and remain there until forced to migrate to safety somewhere else. Meanwhile, the migration triggers seem to have multiplied with time. Unlike those that drive other animals, nearly all of those driving Homo sapiens migration today are man-made. Non-man-made migration triggering factors have, since the last ice age, mostly arisen from climate events, such as El Niño, La Niña, INSO, and include hurricanes, tornadoes, typhoons, superstorms, earthquakes, volcanoes, and forest fires. These have so far been observed to occur in irregular cycles, and often in multi-country, multi-continent patterns, and can result in anything from temporary and medium-term displacements that are nonetheless painful, even to watch, to life-changing destruction that impacts hundreds of thousands of people and causes great economic loss. Major factors driving human migrations today, however, are mostly man-made and self-inflicted. Their increasing tempo is probably an indication of which direction our species' maturity index is headed. These include wars and regional conflicts, human trafficking and modern-day slavery, famine, limitations on the ability to earn, lack of access to education and healthcare, lack of political, religious, ethnic, racial, and other human rights, including freedom to express one's sexual orientation and gender, oppressive and corrupt politicians, oligarchs, business tycoons, and governments, and, more recently, lack of environmental safety, such as pollution of food, water, and air, and, even more heinous, the lack of freedom to migrate, often despite a high probability of death. According to the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, or UNHCR, war and persecution have driven more people from their homes than at any time since records began, with over 71 million men, women, and children now displaced worldwide. This means 1 in every 113 people on Earth is either an asylum seeker, internally displaced, or a refugee, according to the 2015 edition Global Trends report. It has been more than 70,000 years since migrating out of the Great Rift Valley in Ethiopia, and close to 200 since modern civilization has taken hold. Yet, despite all of our technologies, innovations, intelligence, and wealth, we still seem unable to mature beyond self-interest. Little of what drives or blocks Homo sapiens' migration today existed at the time our early ancestors began heading out of the Great Rift Valley. Thankfully, there wasn't anyone turning them back at borders, or leaving them to drown in the seas and rivers of yesteryear, or building border walls and electrified barbed wire fences to keep them out, as is all the rage today, or else we probably wouldn't be here to talk about it. No, there were no passports, border guards, human traffickers, drug-dealing gangs, or powerful countries blocking their freedom to migrate. Our Earth has become a fortress. I often wonder how our species might feel if we were compelled to flee to an extrasolar Earth 2.0, and we had the technology to do it, but found ourselves confronted by a blockade of armed space cruisers, erected by the denizens of that planet to deny us entry. When our forebears left Africa, no one stood in their way, but we may not be so lucky, and payback is never fun. Evolution tends to err on the side of survival, and when we block opportunities for migration, and thereby survival, we are going against the evolutionary grain that got us here. The evolutionary pattern requires freedom to migrate, and our species seems to be turning away from this most basic species survival need. Our increasing inability to recognize and support this need is probably yet another indicator of the level of our species' maturity. Today, blocking members of our own species fleeing climate change, war, and famine, seeking access to other countries on Earth, may be one reason our species could end up blocking itself from access to the stars. There are lessons still to be learned from the migration of our early ancestors. Studies mapping human genetic diversity support the theory that modern humans emerged in Africa, and identify the Middle East as their gateway to the wider world. People everywhere descended from a single African female, from a single migration of early humans from Africa. Unlike us today, they had the freedom, a priori readiness, preparedness, and disposition of hunter-gatherers to pick up and go. Timing turned out to be the next significant factor. According to the genetic and paleontological record, about 100,000 years earlier, and at a time of lower sea levels, previous hominin species, such as Homo erectus and Neanderthals, migrated from Africa to Eurasia through a now flooded land passage at the southern end of the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb. But Homo sapiens started to leave Africa only between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago, perhaps using the same corridor, as sea levels were about 230 feet lower, due to the onset of Ice Age conditions that locked up water in vast polar ice caps. According to the Genographic Project on Migratory Crossings, underscoring the importance of timing, there were probably earlier attempts. Modern human remains have been found at sites in the Middle East that are in excess of 100,000 years old. Yet these trailblazers likely left little or no genetic trace on humans living today, suggesting that either climate change forced them to double back or they died out. How significant was it that our forebears were able to leave just when they did? Was it coincidental that it was during the onset of an ice age, when the sea level was lower, making it easier for them to cross and migrate out of Africa? Was that ice age, which also rendered the Great Rift Valley habitat no longer capable of sustaining life, which in turn triggered our forebears' migration, occurring when it did, just a big happenstance, though a wonderfully coordinated one? Or was this evolution doing a Moses long before there was a Moses, sucking up the waters of the seas and oceans into the polar caps, parting the waters, so to speak, so our ancestors could migrate? How serendipitous was that? And digging deeper still, how even more serendipitous was it that crossing was only possible due to the rupture of the African and Arabian tectonic plates some 25 million years ago, resulting in that land passage? Reverse the order of these events, and the survival of our species might not have occurred. There is no doubt their timing was spot on, but was it simple coincidence, or was it evolution at work once more, rearranging the Earth as it had that ice age? Now, 70,000 years later, as we, their descendants, contemplate our own potential migration to another planet, might evolution do for us what it appears to have done for them? Would there also be similar, seemingly serendipitous events? Might there be such a thing as a right time window to migrate to an Earth 2.0, as there was for our forebears to migrate out of Africa? A time when it would be more favorable than other times to look for, find, and migrate to an Earth 2.0, as there appeared to have been a right time for our forebears to leave Africa, when an ice age appeared to have significantly lowered the risk of a Red Sea crossing. And could it be, too, that as plate tectonics facilitated the path across the Red Sea, and climate change triggered that migration out of Africa, might climate change once more be sounding the alarm for yet another Homo sapiens survival-driven migration? This time, perhaps, rather than plate tectonics carving a path across the Earth, an alignment of Earth with potential habitable planets as the solar system travels through the Milky Way galaxy will bring our planet much closer to a potential Earth 2.0. And what could more favorable mean in this context? Perhaps a rogue star will pass near or through our solar system just when we need it, as Shoal's star is believed to have done 70,000 years ago, passing at a distance 5 times closer than our closest star, Proxima Centauri, which is 4.2 light-years away, possibly as our forebears were heading out of Africa. Now, that would be as serendipitous as they come, wouldn't you say? And wouldn't that be a worthy mission for NASA? To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heavens. Book of Ecclesiastes 3:1, and Peter Seeger's 1950s song, Turn, Turn, Turn. We might well be here today only because our ancestors got the timing right. How did they? Was climate change their alarm clock and migration trigger? Earlier, we observed how evolution appears to employ climate change, and the often accompanying habitat loss, to prod species to the next higher level of maturity and migration, or failing that, to extinction. Many now believe that habitat loss due to climate change finally drove our ancestors to leave Africa. As noted in Chapter 2, shortly after Homo sapiens first evolved, the harsh climate conditions nearly extinguished our species. Some scientists even believe that the human population may have fallen to just a few hundred individuals who managed to survive in one location. This cold snap would have made life extraordinarily difficult for our African ancestors, and indeed, the genetic evidence points to a sharp reduction in population size around that time. In fact, the human population likely dropped to fewer than 10,000. Just like birds, butterflies, salmon, and wildebeests, our early ancestors had the means to migrate. They needed little more than their hunting tools, the occasional raft, and of course their own legs and feet. They mostly walked across the planet. While there were none of the modern modes of travel we take for granted today, they were equipped with what they needed at that time: access to food and water, and the means to protect themselves from the elements, as evolution rarely expects a species to accomplish things it's not yet equipped to do. Monarch butterflies and birds can fly, salmon can swim, even upstream, wildebeests can run, and Homo sapiens can walk. Per the diagram below, they literally walked across the earth. But who were these original hunter-gatherers who migrated out of Africa and went on to become the origin of all extant humans today? What, if anything, is known about them? What might they have looked like? Using DNA analysis, scientists have identified what they refer to as the oldest race of people in Africa and on the planet. The most detailed analysis of African DNA indicates the San people of southern Africa, who have lived as hunter-gatherers for thousands of years, are likely to be the oldest population of humans on Earth. According to the article World's Most Ancient Race Traced in DNA Study, published in The Independent in 2009, these scientists analyzed the genetic variation within the DNA of more than 3,000 Africans and found that the San were among the most genetically diverse group, indicating that they are probably the oldest continuous population of humans on the continent and on Earth. These scientists also found genetic markers in the DNA of present-day inhabitants of East Africa living near the Red Sea that indicate they belonged to the same ancestral group that migrated out of Africa to populate Asia and the rest of the world. West Africans speaking the Niger-Kordofanian language were found to share many genetic traits with African Americans, indicating they were the ancestors of most of the slaves sent to the New World. While there is no way to say what these migrations were like at the time, accounts of modern migrants fleeing war-torn countries like Syria and parts of Africa, or from drought-stricken parts of the globe, offer some insight. But these bear only scant resemblance to what our early ancestors might have encountered. While their migrations were a matter of life and death, With 2020 hindsight, we know the survival of our entire species rested on them as well. When Roman legions invaded the early British Isles, they encountered, among other peoples, the early Brits. When the Brits and Europeans migrated to the Americas, they encountered the indigenous peoples of this hemisphere. In almost every case, these foreigners drove the natives to near extinction. One thing early humans would not have encountered, for the most part, were other humans. And one must say, thankfully, given the reception modern-day migrants are receiving. Wherever they went, they might well have been the first of their kind to have gone there. They would have had no idea what they would encounter. There were no countries, hence no borders, passports, border guards, human traffickers, drug-smuggling gangs, or governments blocking their freedom to migrate. Early Earth was still a pristine paradise, devoid of the ills one is sorry to observe our species has since unleashed on it wherever we have settled. Apart from the fact that these migrations enabled Homo sapiens to begin to dominate the planet, one can think of few stories. The jury is still out on this one. I hope evolution turns out to be right about us, in which human migration has, so far, been a good thing for Earth's environment, its habitats, oceans, forests, ecosystems, flora and fauna, or even our species itself. If you can think of any, please send me some. There can be little doubt that while our species has made remarkable progress on many fronts, we still have a lot to learn and do when it comes to our ability to sustainably coexist in an Earth-like habitat before we are ready to take on another world. While our early ancestors knew for sure they had to leave Africa, they probably didn't have a specific destination in mind or any idea of what to expect, the way people migrating to another country do today. Few, if any, in the migrating party would have seen any place other than the Great Rift Valley in Ethiopia. There were no maps, no roads, no well-trodden or previously marked paths. They may have had no idea where they would end up. They had no specific destination. They were truly going where no man had gone before. Theirs were more than likely the first human footprints left where they traveled, and the first eyes to gaze out across the vast expanse or peer into the dense forests, unable to know whether weal or woe awaited them. All they probably knew for sure was that they were likely to encounter fierce predators as well as prey, find fresh water and food sources, fresh air to breathe and land to walk on, or streams and rivers to float down. Their destination, which must have changed from day to day, was probably wherever they found a source of food and water and felt relatively safe from predation. One doubts that when they set out, they could have imagined they and their descendants would end up walking to the ends of the earth, any more than we can imagine that because some men have walked on the moon, our descendants will one day populate the stars. Our forebears might have had no idea where their journeys would take them. All they knew was that they had to leave their habitat in Africa if they wanted to survive. It is no small coincidence that a similar migration has begun 70,000 years later by some of their descendants, and in some cases for the same reason: a habitat failing mostly due to climate change and the desire to survive. These early migrants were the first economic migrants of our species to leave Africa and survive, and we, their descendants, should be grateful they were not halted and sent back, or left to drown in the rivers they crossed, or caught and traded as human slaves, as in Libya today. From them came a world full of people, you and me, something those blocking today's African, Middle Eastern, and other migrants might want to bear in mind. Our ancient ancestors could not have imagined how differently this latter-day migration out of Africa would turn out for their descendants. They probably could not have dreamt of a time when their descendants would overspread the surface of the entire earth, leaving very little, if any, unclaimed space for migrants like themselves, fleeing to find shelter and start over. Nor, as they themselves were fleeing, would they have imagined there could come a time, even 70,000 years later, when their fleeing descendants would be blocked and turned away, not by aliens, but by members of their own species. Today, with no place else left to go, and 7.8 billion of us and counting, it is more than likely that if faced with yet another potential species-wide extinction event, the next human survival-driven migration will not be from Africa to Europe or Central America to the US, but from Earth to another planet. And amazing as it might seem 70,000 years later, despite all we have accomplished and are most proud of, we are just like our early forebears. We still don't know where we might be heading and what we'll find once we get there, assuming we get there. All we know is that the next species-wide, survival-driven migration can only be interplanetary, and maybe, like our forebears, we will find that we are the first intelligent species to arrive there. The pressures that drove early human migration are still very much with us today. But the evolutionary escape hatch, survival through migration, is fast closing. In fact, if Homo sapiens were to be confronted over the next several hundred years with a growing species-wide extinction event, despite the enormous across-the-board advances of the last 200 years, today's migrants leaving Africa would be worse off than early humans were when they left Africa. Those early African migrants faced a mainly uninhabited planet's worth of unclaimed territory. Today, all that territory has been claimed. Migrating as our forebears did is no longer possible. Migration, as early humans experienced it, is no longer an option. The hunter-gatherers fleeing the Great Rift Valley area of Africa might have numbered in the very low hundreds, probably 200 or so, very unlikely to be in the thousands, and were more accustomed, predisposed, and prepared to pack up and go at a moment's notice than we could ever hope to be today. While they might not have known where they were going, they at least did not have to worry about being denied access to the lands they encountered. The possibility of having to leave the planet as they knew it then, with its gravity and oxygen-rich atmosphere, sunshine, innumerable food and water sources, and relative ease of finding a place to pitch camp and go when they felt the urge, was not even imaginable and never could have crossed their minds. Evolution appears to match each survival migration episode with the tools and capabilities necessary for a successful migration. All they needed to get going were their legs and feet, simple tools, and a few weapons. The rest they would invent along the way. If one can imagine evolution with a geologic stopwatch, evolution's clock, that times how long a species might spend on a particular rung of the maturity model, it might appear that 70,000 years after that first migration, evolution is getting ready to signal the countdown to transitioning to the next rung. Homo sapiens definitely have a few more rungs to go, but if we manage to successfully negotiate these and avoid self-extinction, we will face the final few rungs to evolutionary maturity and becoming an interplanetary species. Or we will go extinct. If our species is approaching the beginning of another species-wide, survival-driven migration, we will need what our early ancestors had, plus some. Compared to interplanetary and intersolar system migration, theirs might be considered a less challenging migration. But evolution has shown a tendency to match the degree of challenge with the rung and level of maturity on the species' survival maturity model. So, if a Homo sapiens survival-driven migration is looming ahead of us, and also seems to be orders of magnitude more challenging than it might have been for early humans, it can only be so because we have clawed our way up a few more rungs of the ladder on the way to evolutionary maturity. So, what might one need for such an interplanetary migration? Without in any way attempting to diminish the massive challenge and awesome struggle and responsibility our forebears' migration out of Africa must have been, as they carried with them the weight and future of an entire species, it is important to draw attention to the essential differences an interplanetary migration implies for our or any Earth-life species, and to the evolutionary phase change such a migration implies. In Chapter 5, we noted some of these evolutionary phase changes, such as from non-cellular to single-cellular, to nucleated single-cellular, to multicellular organisms, to complex animals and plants, to nascent intelligent species, or hominins, and finally, so far, to Homo sapiens, the last of the hominins. Each phase change was separated and or precipitated by significant species survival challenges, such as mass extinctions, causing many key species of the prior phase to go extinct, or be carried forward into the succeeding phase as symbionts in replacement species. We noted, too, that accompanying each of these evolutionary life form transitions was a step, and in some cases an order of magnitude, change in the succeeding species' complexity, habitat, adaptations, and innovations needed to survive in those new habitats. So, if one were to view a potential interplanetary migration from the above perspective, and ask what a species confronting such a migration might need, and if one were to further ask what other prior Earth-life migrations exhibited similar characteristics, one potential candidate immediately leaps out: the first animal species, or vertebrates, migration from sea to land, otherwise known as land colonization, a word I would have rather not used, that occurred during the Devonian period, some 375 million years ago. This was a momentous event in animal life history, perhaps as momentous as the transition of our early microbe ancestors to oxygenic photosynthesis and respiration. These early animals had to come up with critical key adaptations and innovations to survive in their new habitat, dry land. And not unlike those early animals, Homo sapiens, too, will need to come up with its own adaptations and innovations to survive in a new habitat, outer space, or on a different planet. In fact, it is amazing how eerily similar, yet opposite, animal migration to dry land compares with a potential Homo sapiens transition to outer space or another planet. Animals emerging from the oceans needed the ability to overcome gravity,